Okay, here I am inside After Effects, and I just want to bring in both of the different renders that I exported from Maya using Arnold in the last video. Now, in order to do this, I can just go to File, Import, Import File, and I'll find it in my renders folder. Now, I have based these renders on whether or not I used in the Arnold area light one sample for the shadows or four samples for the shadows. And we'll just take a look at what we have here as our differences. So I just click on the very first image in that image sequence, make sure that OpenEXR sequence is checked as well so that it comes in as an image sequence, and click import. Now, when this comes in, it will be coming in as 30 frames per second as the default that we have in After Effects. So I need to right click on that, go to Interpret Footage, Main, and tell it to assume the frame rate of 24 frames per second because that's what we had created this at. All right, cool. Now I'm going to import in the other sequence as well. I can also do that just by double clicking inside the project area. So if I double click inside the project area and I go up to the section that says 4 samples and bring that in the same way, they're actually named the same. It's a little bit confusing. I will interpret this footage at 24 frames per second as well. I might just rename this as, let's say, rename footage. Can I rename my footage? I'm not sure if I can actually. Yeah, there it is at the bottom. 1 sample and 4 samples. Okay, cool. Now, before I take a look at these, before I bring them into my composition area, I want to make sure that I change my bit depth of the composition that I'm going to create. So right now it's set to 8 bits per channel, which is BPC. I'm going to click on that. Remember, the images that we created, because we created them as EXR images, are actually 32 bits per channel, which means that there's a lot more color information in there than just a standard 8-bit channel. So that when we do color correction, we have a lot more range of change, so to speak, that we can apply. And as a result, we have a lot more control. It looks a lot better. So I'm going to change this to 32 bits per channel and set OK. All right, so let's drag in just sample 1. I'm going to drag that onto a new composition, just onto this little icon right here. Okay, and it pulls it down there. So let's just open up our window here so we can better see the whole thing. All right. Pull this down, and now I'm just going to press spacebar to have it play through. All right. Okay, cool. So it's very short. It looks nice, right? It's very simple to get a nice render from Arnold. But what we can see is there's a lot of chatter. All right, that noisy bit, and where you see all this little fuzz that's happening in there, I call that chatter. You can see it over here as well. It's not so bad in this area. It's not as much contrast between the dark and the light areas as we see down here. There's a little bit going on up here. So let's compare that now to our 4 sample shot. I'm just going to drag that on top because it will just, if I turn the visibility off, I can swap between them. And you can actually see that here's the 4 sample one, and here's the 1 sample one. If you look in the shadow area, you can see some pretty big differences there. So let me just play this now. All right, so that's looking a lot better. Now there definitely still is a little bit of noise going on in here. I can see it. But what I want to do is I want to play around with one of my settings in here to see if I can get the noise reduced to a certain level and solve this problem for myself. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back down to the 1 sample one. So I'm turn off 4 samples there. Just pull this up a little bit. Now, I have some pretty obvious noise issues happening right around here. If I just scrub through, yeah, so I'd say that there's pretty obvious noise issues going on right here as well. So what I'm going to do is come in here and go and make sure I click on the one that's the 1 sample clip and come up to Effect, NeatVideo. Now I have to tell you that NeatVideo is a separate plugin. It does not come with After Effects. You have to pay for it. It's a very valuable plugin, but it's something that we do have as part of our installation here at AUT. So you can use it here and reduce noise. All right, so it doesn't really look like much happens when you do this, but what we need to do is in the reduce noise options, click on options. And this is going to pop up a separate window here. And the way that we use this is we have to define an area of relatively even noise. All right, and I'm going to start out by just saying, all right, this area here is pretty even, right? As I'm dragging out that square or rectangle, eventually it tells me that it's either too small, not big enough, or big enough, green, right? And it might tell me if the area is not uniform as well, because it prefers a uniform area. So I'm going to take this area here, and I'm not getting any errors, which is good. And once I've defined that area of noise, I'm going to use it as a profile for detecting noise in the scene. So I'm going to click on Auto Profile. And it's okay, area is small, I'm not too worried about that. All right, still nothing's happened. But if I click now on Noise Filter Settings up here, right, and I play around with some of these options, I can choose Preview versus No Preview. Just doing this, there is a little bit of a change that I can see. It might be very minor. As I drag this up, I might be getting better. If I pull it all the way up to 100 and I compare it before and after, I can see a change. Not 100%. I'm still getting some issues down here, but that's probably about as good as I can get with this as it is. So I'll click Apply. All right, and that will apply it to the overall shot. And if I render now, let's just see what we get. Now, obviously, I'm not solving the issue down here. So this is certainly something where I say, well, maybe one sample in my lighting there is not enough for those shadows, right? Because even with this great plugin, which does a pretty fantastic job in most things, it's still not getting rid of all of that. Let's just try one other possible solution here. Let's go back up here and change where we're sampling from. Let's just say this, and of course it's going to say area not uniform, which may or may not cause a problem. But we'll auto profile, and now when I do this, you can see that yeah, it has gone through and kind of like softened things out, but it's really kind of made it ugly at the same time, right? So that's not the best solution either. So I would say that I need at least 2 samples in my light shadows. But even when I look at my example with 4 samples here, all right, there's still noise, there's still chatter happening. If you look really closely in here, you'll see it. So what I can do is once I have a close but not perfect result, something like this one here, instead of continually upping the samples in Maya, if I come in now and I use that NeatVideo plugin, and I'm going to do the same thing that I did before, just take this general area here and say Auto Profile, Noise Filter, right? Now this overall is going to pretty much get rid of all the noise. Now if I just sort of preview back and forth here, I can see that all that noise basically just disappears now because it's at such a low level to begin with. But to get rid of all that noise, using the settings in Maya would take a long time. The renders would take a very long time, and you might not have that time to spare. Just a quick introduction about what these controls are. So you'll see that chrominance is always set to 100 here by default. Chrominance refers to the color channels, whether or not it's blurring in the color channels. And luminance sits separately, which is black and white, so your values and tone scale. So you can leave it at the defaults. Generally, it's better to be blurring in the color channel than it is to be blurring in the black and white channel, which is why it's set this way. And I'll click Apply. All right, so now we have a nice overall result and something that I'm quite happy with, and I get the payoff, the benefit of this, without having to wait so long as I would in Maya, for example. Right. Now, another thing that I would need to do, potentially, is to do some color correction in here. And this is not going to be the end-all, be-all of color correction, but some things that I always like to do before I finish off my renders and whatnot, or finish off my compositions, is to go into Effects, Color Correction, and I'll start out with an exposure adjustment. Especially since this is a 32-bit image, working with your exposure adjustment can be very useful. Now, what I'm going to do here is play around first with exposure, right? And you can see that I can drag my exposure quite high and quite low throughout this. I do eventually start to get some banding in the image if I go down really low, but banding's not too much of an issue throughout most of it. Now, one of the things I've discovered sometimes is that if I put reduce noise after my exposure adjustment, I might get a better result. So I do my exposure first and pull it way down. I'm not getting that same banding, right? And it just has to do with the order of these operations. So yeah, exposure first and then playing around might work better, though actually it appears that the reduced noise is kind of cutting in there a little bit. Let's turn that off. Just see. Yeah, so actually, I guess we have to kind of leave it the way it was to begin with. That was a red herring, as they might say. All right, so now really I don't need to pull it up too much, but I'm going to pull it up a little bit just to brighten up the image. So if our exposure was at 0 to begin with, I'm going to pull it up to somewhere maybe around here or so, right? Just makes it feel like there's definitely some strong light coming in here. But I also kind of want to pull in some of the other aspects of this image. So I'm just going to pull down my gamma a little bit, right? And then I might still pull up my exposure a little more. And overall now I'm getting a little bit more of an interesting image. Something that's a bit more beautiful, I think. You know, what's great about this, because it is a 32-bit image, is that you can really get in there and start seeing all that detail that you have there in your darks that you would otherwise lose. And which you certainly wouldn't have this much color range in a 8-bit image, for instance. So something like this looks pretty nice. Maybe even pull it down to like around there. Okay, and if I compare before and after, right? Before, that looks kind of boring now. This looks a lot more interesting. Now you just have to make sure that it works for whatever your scene is. You know, if you need the scene to be really dark and you only have one light source, and you might not want it to be this bright over here, right? You can pull your exposure down or something like that. You can also play around with things like overall color correction, even using, let's see, what options do I have here? Actually, if you go down to synthetic aperture, the color finesse option, it'll pop in down here, but if you click on full interface, you'll get a color correction tool palette, which is quite fun to work with, and it just takes a second for it to load up. So some of these things are like little extra things. Now this appears to be looking at it without the, I was trying to see the result here. Let me put this first. There we go. Let's try this. Too bad I had to close out of it. No, I'm still not seeing the result that I had there with the exposure. So usually this is what you would do first before you do your exposure. And what it will do is you can come in here and play around with the individual color controls. So if I want to be looking at like RGB, for instance, I can be looking at how I can play around with my reds, or adding in extra red, adding in extra green, adding in extra blue. I can do it into the shadows. So if I wanted the shadows to be a little bit more blue overall, right? And so it's just basically the darks, then I can add that in here a little bit. If I want the midtones to be a little bit more green, for example, then I can add that in there. Now I'm getting this kind of interesting sort of sci-fi washout happening. And if I want my highlights to be a little bit more red or a little less red, then I could play around with it like that. Let's just see here. go through some of our options. These are just the different waveforms that tell me about various types of information that exist in the shot in terms of the overall luminance values. Now, I like to work with my secondaries as well to be able to control the overall range. But actually, tell you what, I'm going to close out of this. I'll say, okay, we'll keep this color combination that I've done here. And yeah, I think that's oh, sorry, open this up here. Instead of having to go into the big interface, what can be good is to simply go into the simplified interface and play around with these overall settings. So I'm going to go ahead and delete the version that I'd created there. And I'm just going to go back and I'll say, all right, synthetic aperture, color finesse. We'll go with the simplified interface. And if I want my overall color to change in some direction, I can do it through the master. Right? If I pull it down in this direction, just make it a little bit more blue overall, I can do it that way. Or a little bit more green overall. Right? But I can also control this directly through like the shadows. So if I want my shadows to be cooler, that kind of looks okay. And I want my midtones to be a little bit warmer. And my highlights to be a little bit warmer. Right, it's starting to look pretty nice. Something like that. You can also control the curves. Right, so if you know that you want your darks to sort of flatten out a little bit earlier, or you can even pull it up a little bit if you want it to be maybe a little bit foggier. Okay. Not really too concerned about the curves. I'll just say reset all curves. And there's lots of things you can play around with down here. But for the most part, you don't need to go into everything. Usually this is all I focus on. Now, let's compare before and after now. So before, after. Very minimal change, but enough. It creates an overall feeling, right? Something a little bit different than before. So if I leave that on, right? I've definitely gone in there and made some big changes. So if I look at this is what it looked like before. That's just the raw render versus now. Huge difference, right? So if I want to take that out now, this is just one of my shots. I'm going to export this out so that I can bring it into Premiere to be able to edit it. And now, so when I go to render this out, I'm going to go to Composition, Add to Render Queue. And here I'm going to go to tell it which format to render out through. So I'll choose my output module. Currently it's set to lossless. I don't want it to be an AVI. I'm going to set it as a QuickTime file. And my format options, I'm going to go in here and leaving the H.264 is fine, so long as you leave it at 100% quality. Now there is, in fact, some, what's the right word? There is some compression that happens when you do this. And that can lead to loss of correct data. For this project, it's okay. Right? But just as we move forward into more advanced projects, what I would say is you don't really ever want to get into a compressed format until your very, very final export. So what I would normally do at this stage is I would export it out as like a TIFF sequence, for example, and at 100% quality. And it will remain a sequence of images. And I can import that as an image sequence into Premiere, just like I did here in After Effects. But that does create more files. They're a lot larger. And so for now, H.264 is fine. Okay, so we'll click OK. In fact, actually, I wouldn't normally use TIFF in the QuickTime format. I would normally come down here and choose TIFF sequence. So I just got myself a little bit confused there because I forgot where I was in the scheme of things. But QuickTime H.264. Otherwise, I would just use a TIFF sequence. That's what I was trying to say. Okay, and that's pretty much all you need to worry about. We don't have any audio here, so we're not concerned about that. Choose OK, and then output 2. Where are we going to put this? And this is up to you. So for me, I will just, for now, dump it on the desktop, and for you, you should put it someplace where you know you're going to find it. So click render, and it renders through. Depending on how much stuff you've done to your scene, this could take longer or shorter. Right. I love how my flour sack has peaches, Pringles, and Nutella. It's gonna be a fun night. Okay, so let me just quickly open that up. Okay, so here it is, exported out. And one of the things that you'll notice is that it looks a bit washed out. And this just happens to be part of QuickTime's something or other that it does to the files. It's some kind of weird exposure adjustment that it does to the files. But I can tell you that if you bring this exact same file into Premiere, it's going to look fine. It's correctly adjusted there. So it looks exactly like it did in After Effects, which is good news. Now, I can see a little bit of compression issues that are going on. Like I can see a little bit of noise in there, and it's different kinds of noise this time, sort of a globbier noise. If you wanted to get away from that altogether, what you could do in After Effects to just get the least noisy result possible, if I were to go in and to just duplicate this output, is instead of using H.264 as your format, you could use the animation codec. The trouble is that the files that get produced from this are really, really big, but they won't have any compression. So, use your judgment. All right, depends on how much time you have as well and how much disk space. So yeah, that pretty much brings us to a wrap here. I hope that's of help, and good luck to you all.